Hi, Dan Fingas from Rights and Democracy.
Hi, how you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks so much for being here. And we have 4 committee members, Allison and Senator Clarkson's on Zoom. We're jumping. We've spent so long on housing as like one block subject matter, and now we're jumping around a lot. So we're going back to minimum wage, and we appreciate you being here to discuss our bill.
I mean, I have to follow Treasurer Peacock, which is never an easy order, but I'm happy to be here today. Thank you, Chair Ram Hinsdale and members of Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs Committee for having me today. My name is Dan Fingas, and I'm the Movement Politics Director at Rights and Democracy. First off, I want to thank you all for having members and staff of RAD in your committee during RAD's lobby day on February 15th. We were able to have 24 members and staff testifying in person and virtually to 8 legislative committees and sharing their life experiences. So thanks so much for taking the time for that. When RAD was founded in 2015, our first major project was to ensure that all Vermonters got paid sick days. So I'm happy to be here to continue the conversation on how we make Vermont a place that supports all workers and all forms of work. We have a long way to go to make Vermont a place that everyone is financially secure and can afford not only to survive, but thrive. The bills I will be discussing today will help us move towards that reality. From our communications chair, Ram Hinsdale, I plan to speak about both the S-108, the minimum wage bill, and the S-102, the employment protection and collective bargaining bill. All right, great. To start with S-108, the minimum wage bill, RAD was the anchor organization for the Vermont Raise the Wage Coalition, who for 3 years waged a campaign to raise the minimum wage to $15 by 2025. So we are really happy to see that Senator Clarkson and the other sponsors of this bill are working to finish the job. The goal of $15 by 2025 was first initiated in 2018, and thanks to the Raise the Wage bill passed in 2020 after a governor veto override, we are still on that path. The issue today is that with inflation, cost of consumer goods, and overall cost of living in Vermont, a $15 minimum wage may no longer be sufficient. The basic needs budget number for a 2-adult household with no children is already $15.33 and will likely grow in the next 2 years. 2 adults living with no children in a 1-bedroom apartment is hardly a typical living situation in Vermont. This means an adult living alone, 2 adults with children, and many other Vermonters would need more than $15.33 to survive. A $15 minimum wage by 2025 with a 5% a year increase after that seems like the least we can do. While the steady increase in the minimum wage after 2025 at a 5% or CPI is a good model overall, we don't feel using 5% as the cap when CPI may go above that. And if CPI goes above that, that means groceries, utilities, and other basic needs are going to be raising higher than 5%. And so we would create a situation where workers continue to fall further and further behind. So we'd love to see something that uses a metric that is tied to the actual cost of living and to the cost to Vermonters. The other portion of S-108 that I want to speak to is the sub-minimum wage. As many of you may know, the whole concept of sub-minimum wage and a tipped wages are vestiges of slavery. After emancipation, the restaurant industry sought to hire newly freed Black people without paying them, force them to live on tips. This concept was made law, excluding a workforce of mostly Black women from the full minimum wage, even when other workers received the federal minimum wage as part of the New Deal in 1938. Today, Vermont remains one of 43 states that permits this business model built on slavery and has allowed a workforce that is overwhelmingly women and disproportionately women of color to continue to receive a sub-minimum wage. The sub-minimum wage for tip workers was a problem long before the pandemic for a workforce of thousands of tip workers in Vermont who are overwhelmingly women working in restaurants and bars.
Sorry, how many states now don't?
So 7 states have it.
7 states
have
a 1 minimum.
One fair wage, yeah.
Okay.
A single minimum wage for everyone. And I'll list those states in just a second. So you'll see some of them are pretty comparable to us. These workers have struggled with twice the poverty rate of other workers and the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry because they must tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families on tips they earn. With the pandemic, the sub-minimum wage for tip workers changed from an economic, race, and gender injustice to one of life and death. Customer hostility, health risks, and harassment increased. We heard stories of tip workers being asked to remove their masks so men could judge their looks and tips on that basis. On top of that, tip workers were put in the impossible situation of having to enforce COVID protocols on the same restaurants for whom they had to get tips to survive. For decades, 7 states have done it differently. California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Montana, Alaska, and Minnesota, and I think those last 3, Montana, Alaska, and Minnesota, have some similarities to Vermont, all require a full minimum wage with tips on top. These 7 states have higher restaurant job growth rates, higher small business growth rates, and higher tipping averages than Vermont. They also have 1/2 of the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry and lost fewer restaurants during the pandemic than Vermont. Ending the subminimum wage is not only better for tipped workers, but for Vermont's economy. That's why we need to end the subminimum wage for all workers and create one true minimum wage in Vermont now. I know S108 calls for a study on these issues, but we really should be looking to end the subminimum wage now for all Vermont workers. The second bill I want to testify about is S102, the Employment Protection and Collective Bargaining Bill, a bill many are calling the VT PRO Act, as it has many elements of the PRO Act that's been introduced on the federal level. We are excited to see this bill as presented, as it addresses many needed workers' rights and workplace issues in Vermont. I wanted to highlight the parts of the bill that are specifically important to our members and are crucial to be kept in the final version of the bill. The first is the ending of no-cause termination or at-will employment. This is a huge step for Vermont workers and helps level out the imbalance between workers and their employers. Requiring verified reasons for termination is not only more fair, it also creates more stability for workers in our communities. S102 also has important provisions to end wage discrimination and allow for pay transparency in the workplace. Allowing coworkers to discuss their own wages and know that they are being paid fairly is a crucial step to real wage transparency. We also support the section on First Amendment rights in the workplace, especially ending of mandatory participation in meetings to dissuade workers from joining a union. These captive audience meetings are routinely used to wear down workers, feed false information, and disrupt a worker's desire to form a union with their coworkers. We know that these captive audience meetings have been used even recently in the Starbucks Workers Union campaign in South Burlington. These meetings have no job-specific value and should not be mandatory. We also love to see that farm and domestic worker rights to collectively bargain is included. As we see that with the subminimum wage, we have historically decided that certain kind of workers don't deserve to have the same rights, which is why it is important that farm workers and domestic workers have the same rights to unionize as all other Vermonters. There is no reason to deny these rights, especially to 2 classifications of workers whose majority is people of color and women. It's another example of how the economy is set up on systems that are racist and sexist and need to be changed. The last provision of S102 I'd like to speak to is majority sign-up. That is the provision that if 50% plus 1 of public employees petition for election, then they are granted union recognition. As workers have the right to unionize, it makes sense to allow a majority of public employees in a given workspace an easy ability to do so. We know that union elections can be long processes that take time and money. We don't feel the public institutions should spend taxpayer funding fighting their own workers if a clear majority of these workers want a union. That is my testimony. I'm happy to take questions.
Very efficient. Senator Cummings, do you have? Oh, okay, just nodding along. Okay.
Dan, can you submit your testimony to Scott? We don't have it on the website.
Yes, I will definitely send it to him right after this.
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
I know that when we spoke, any organization we talk to, it's hard to get people who feel comfortable speaking to their own experience on some of these issues. It's very sensitive. If anyone in your network wants to write a letter or come in to testify briefly or be on Zoom, we certainly welcome, personal stories firsthand.
Yeah, and I will also just note, I know during our lobby day, Infinity was part of the testimony, and she spoke about how her employer pays above a fair wage and how it's made a really big difference in her life.
Right.
She's actually a New Hampshire resident who has been now works in Vermont because of the higher wage that she can get, and is attracting her as a worker into this state over the river.
Right.
And I think the better we do for workers, especially around wages, the more we can actually, from Massachusetts, from New Hampshire, bring people into the state, and we need a workforce.
Right.
Yeah, and I think Lawson's and there's other restaurants and establishments that not only pay a fair wage, but then you can pool your tips to donate, so you have this sort of sense of purpose.
Yeah. Red Hen Bakery.
Yeah.
There's a number of them with that model, and they're thriving businesses. They're growing businesses that are doing this.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Senator,
the customers appreciate it.
Mhm.
Senator Clarkson.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say Matt Barowitz is going to be bringing us data at the end of March, which is going to be very revealing, because I think we're going to be a little surprised by restaurant wages, quite frankly, now that so much is done digitally on cards. and we're able to track tips, he alluded to the fact that actually restaurant workers are making very strong wages now that we can look at sort of more transparency on the tip front. So that's part of why I wanted this study is, I think, very important, because I think now that we are going to have more information and data on that, we certainly know about the harassment issues. We've had excellent testimony over the years about the challenges with sub-minimum wage, there's no question. But I think that some of the financial data is going to be very interesting for Matt at the end of March, now that we're able to track it better.
Yeah, we're gonna, there's a lot of people who want the best data to move this forward. So we're gonna look at a basic needs budget task force that's coming over, and probably still have this on the agenda after crossover.
Yeah, and speaking of the study committee that's built out in the bill, I do also wonder if is a way to make sure that there are a few more workers or working class people on it. I think it calls for one person, one employer, one person, and then one rep, one senator, and then a bunch of agency, administration folks. And I wonder if, figuring out a way to have a few voices, maybe from different parts of the state, in that conversation. They're going to have very different perspectives where they live in the state.
Not monolithic at all.
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
Good point.
Well, I live in Washington County.
To that point, I'm just thinking about, so you have restaurant workers and then medical care workers, I think are big amount of folks who are underpaid.
Yeah, and domestic workers.
Or domestic work, right.
Domestic workers, farm workers.
What's the biggest group in terms of
I think
numbers of
tipped workers
people?
are definitely the biggest within the sub-minimum wage.
Okay, so we make sure we have.
Yeah, and
so we might want to specify that category.
Yeah.
Particularly.
Yeah, and I think especially as the state's economy has trended towards tourism and other things, it's become a bigger and bigger part of our economy.
Okay.
Domestic.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
And domestic workers. Oh, in hotels.
Stay at the Econo Lodge, you get.
I don't think that
Oh,
hotel.
They get paid minimum wage.
There's suddenly envelopes in every room saying, wouldn't you like to tip?
Yeah, well, they are, well, technically they have to meet a certain threshold to be considered a tipped worker. I hope that hotels are not using tip envelopes at the end of stays as a way to then not pay them the minimum wage. We should definitely check in on that.
That is my concern.
Senator Clarkson is saying that they are paid minimum wage. They're supposed to be.
They're supposed to be.
The housekeeping is paid minimum wage. There is, and if you tip, it's above, just like what some of us are hoping, it's above. So it's above whatever they're paying. But I could double check at the Capitol Plaza. But
In-home
And that could
housekeepers.
be
Yeah.
Yeah, in-home
different, yeah,
nannies
right.
would probably follow.
Yeah.
And how many farm workers? How big of a group is that?
I don't know the number. I can get that number from Migrant Justice. and
Okay.
some
I
other
was gonna
folks.
say, I think we've invited Migrant Justice to come in. I'm looking at, some of our unions coming in tomorrow. When it comes to helping domestic workers organize, do you know if there's any witness, you have a big
Yeah.
network, there's anybody?
I don't offhand, but I'll definitely look into it.
Right.
I don't know if there's.
I don't know if SEIU has come the closest to.
Childcare workers.
Yeah.
They did childcare work.
We tried, we got
Yeah.
the permission, but
Yeah.
they didn't vote to.
Just anyone in your network, if you think there are people who want to testify.
Yeah, definitely.
Short order, basically a week after crossover would be great.
Okay,
We'll try to move some of those provisions forward and keep working on some after crossover.
great.
But really appreciate your testimony, succinct, helpful. Stay in touch with us.
I know you were trying to do a lot of things this week. I don't think that I felt in the building the pressure until this week. It really feels like everybody's got the
Right,
pressure.
all of a
I
sudden.
think you chairs have had the pressure for weeks now, but now everybody's got the pressure.
Right, exactly. What's gonna make the March 17th?
Yeah.
deadline. But, there are oftentimes, especially for the benefit of our new member and those watching, where things that don't meet the crossover deadline can still be very heavily considered in the other bodies, so it all depends.
Yeah, well, and obviously it's the 2-year biennium, and so we can always potentially start something this year that will be finished next year.
Yeah, we won't let these things go.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, thank you. I'm sure we'll also see you all back when we start to talk about folding different housing bills together and looking at landlord tenant law.
Excellent. Yeah, we would love to be back to talk about that.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you.